Grace Judson Kim, welcome to Love Riz Repeats 50th episode, our 7 words from the cross.
Wow, that's amazing. 50th episode? Like, you're too young to have 50 episodes. That's amazing. You know what? It's a testament to how hard you work and all the amazing things that you do. Because, even to do 5, like, diverse ones are incredible, but to do 50, all of these exciting ones, thank you so much for having me on. I know I did several when I was here in the US, and this might be my 4th one here doing it with you, but then last year we were able to do it together in person, like face to face, which was so exciting. So I was so happy to meet you and your family, and it's great that you're doing these wonderful podcasts and video interviews, because they're watched by so many people all over the world. So thank you for the invitation, and especially, the 7 last words of Jesus during this time of Easter, where the world is kind of shut down and as we're experiencing the pandemic. So I'm glad you're doing this. I think it's an important piece, especially because everyone's going online for worship and reflection and learning and so forth. So thank you for the invite. I thought you might be a little bored of me. Thanks for having me again.
No.
Thanks for having me again.
It's great to have you for several reasons. First of all, you're always so complimentary whenever you come on. So I'm always going to let you come on to say wonderful things about me and the show. But you were I think you were one of, even before it was a podcast, but it was still just the YouTube channel, you were one of the very first guests, like really early on. You did one of our very first interviews. You're also, you have 2 videos in the top 5 most watched of my videos. You're 2 in the top 5, and yours, one of your
That's
ones
amazing.
on, which one? Your one on one which is titled Reconciliation and Climate Justice and a bunch of other things. That's going to get to 1,000 views soon. So we're getting
well, that's a lot of pressure now for me to do this one.
So let's
to maintain my status, top 5.
I know.
I have to come up with something very. I have to come up with something really good now within the next 5 minutes.
All right. Well,
or it'll be so bad that people will watch it anyway.
Yeah. Maybe they'll go, maybe I should check out the other ones to see why. Is she always like this?
One or the other.
Yeah. Oh dear. Well, I'll tell you what. I'll do the reading slowly so you have more time to think.
Yes, please do that.
So the reading we are doing is Luke 23:34. Then Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." And they cast lots to divide his clothing. Yeah. So Grace, what do you hear in these words?
Well, I think because of the coronavirus spreading, it's a new kind of way for me to listen to those words that you just read. And as I was reflecting upon it when you first invited me, I think it's a different read, especially as an Asian American woman. It's hard to forgive. I think it might be one of the hardest things to do in life, to forgive. And for Jesus, that wasn't the first time when he talked about forgiveness. He talks about forgiveness in many occasions. Him wanting to forgive and reminding us to forgive, 70 times 7, to continue to forgive. And so while, he suffered, during that last week, he's suffering, of people, his own disciple denying him, with the triumphal entry and then people just turning around against him. So, it was a very emotional week. And then before he's on that cross, all the beating and the mocking and everything that he experienced. And so, the pain and the suffering that he went through. And then for him to hang on that cross, nearing death, understanding that he will die soon, and still him to say, forgive them, for they do not know what they're doing. it's so powerful because at that moment, if someone is near death, all you think about is, how can I try to survive? You know, what can I do? You're not thinking about forgiveness. You're thinking about, even in the last few moments of your life, you're trying to still breathe, and how much longer can I live? Because that's just a human thing. We want to live as long as possible. As I read, these people that are suffering with COVID-19, and, they're struggling with their breath. They can't breathe, and they go to the hospital, on ventilators, and doctors are doing everything that they can to keep them alive, giving them extra oxygen, opening their pathways. We want to survive. We don't want to die. We want to do everything we can. And so when I think about Jesus on that cross, and, the 7 last words, the first thing he says is, forgive them. Like, that's in his mind. He wants to forgive. And, now 2,000 years later, we say, the purpose of Jesus to come into the world is to die on that cross and to forgive us. Yes, there is the divinity of Jesus. There's also the humanity of Jesus. And for him to still say, forgive them, is, to me, I'm just lost for words that's what he was still thinking on that cross. Because this is a regular, when, as a human being, the scripture tells us to forgive all the time. It's so hard to forgive other people, especially when they have done something wrong to you, right? So Jesus on that cross, suffering so much, and then he still wants to forgive. When I think about the pandemic here in the US, it's spreading, and, the government at the beginning made mistakes. So that's very clear. So now, I think over 10,000 deaths, which is enormous. We're going to be probably number 1 in the number of deaths of any country soon. And as it spreads here in the US, I don't know how it is in Australia and different parts of the world. There's a lot of anti-racism happening. So a lot of white people are saying, well, it happened because of Trump too, calling it the Chinese virus, and Wuhan flu, Chinese flu, etc. It starts with a certain number of people, and then they make it big, and everybody feels like they can do it too. So much anti-racism. And as you share this video by Good Friday, there'll be more cases, but up over 1,000 cases of violence, and so physical violence and verbal abuse towards Asian Americans and Asians. And just yesterday in the US, in New York City, 4 teens were arrested for hate crime because they hit an Asian on a bus, and she had to get stitches on her face and the slurs and everything, so they got arrested. So, the hate crime is rising, but we know they're not all reported because many Asian Americans are afraid to even report. But thus far, over 1,000 cases. Jesus was able to forgive on that cross for the pain that he endured. And I'm wondering how we as an Asian American community can forgive at the end when this all dies down. Because I know after this pandemic dies down, there's going to be an aftermath. People are going to continue to blame Asian Americans, particularly Chinese. But as you know, many people can't differentiate Chinese and Vietnamese or Korean. They're going to blame them for the downfall of the economy, for job losses, etc. So I'm just bracing myself. We as Christians are asked and taught and reminded over and over again, and particularly during this Holy Week and Good Friday and Easter time, we are to forgive. So for me, as I read this and as you read the passage, what will it mean for the Christian community to stand in solidarity with Asians and Asian Americans who are experiencing racism and pain and suffering. And what does it mean for Asians and Asian Americans to forgive and move on? So to me, it just brings a new light because of this huge pandemic that's happening and what is happening to my community. And it doesn't take long for you to go on the internet to see all this happening. And there have been good things in the sense that some of the American churches and denominations are writing pieces, statements to stand in solidarity with the Asian churches and Asian American churches, which is so good to see. But it's still very painful that these are happening to people I know and in my own community. And so I just wanted to begin this interview by kind of putting that out there. For such a time as this, what does it mean to forgive one another, and how Jesus continues to forgive us?
Thank you for that. That's a great place to start, a good place to ground this whole conversation, acknowledging that is happening. One thing I wanted to kind of draw out from what you're saying, it was a couple of things, but the way I want to start is I think it's really helpful the way you've kind of framed up that the forgiveness that Jesus offers, likewise the forgiveness that we are asked to offer, is a very human thing to give. I think that's very difficult to give. It's something we wrestle with and maybe want to withhold, maybe want to offer but struggle to do so, because I think sometimes forgiveness with association with the cross gets kind of just become like an exchange, kind of economicized. That whereas you're saying that showing that this is a thing that we is a tormenting thing that we have to wrestle with to offer. I think is a very helpful acknowledgement that this is something that is not just an exchange.
Yeah. So, even before this pandemic happened, always I struggled with what does it mean to forgive? And when people have done injustice towards me and I'm asked, God requires of us to forgive, it's always been a hard thing. But now it just gets put in a new light when it happens to this larger community, the Asian American community. And I know it's going to last a long time. And, anti-Asian, the racism against Asians and Asian Americans here in the U.S. American soil is nothing new. I don't know how it is in Australia as much, but here, with in 1882, Congress had passed the Chinese Exclusion Act. So when Trump came into power 4 years ago, which unbelievably, I can't believe we surviving the 4 years. He actually put in the Muslim ban. So he was trying to ban Muslims from 7 countries. And, those who don't remember our American history thinks, we think to ourselves, maybe that's our first ban that has ever happened in American soil. But it happened over 100 years ago. In 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act, there was yellow fever. People were just afraid of Asians. They were afraid that they were going to take the jobs, etc. Meanwhile, the Asians that came to work here were doing menial jobs that nobody wanted. They put their life on, they risked their lives as they worked on the railroad, and they were, putting dynamites in mountains, and many people died. And they were working as indentured workers. So that, it was supposed to be in place for 10 years. So a lot of the Chinese, they couldn't leave the country. They had to walk around with papers. They had to prove that they were kind of residents. They were never citizens in American soil. So there was a lot of fear against Asian and particularly Chinese. So that was only supposed to last 10 years. But Congress kept extending it and extending it until 1943. That's a long time. So it's very recent history where, people were so afraid of Asian Americans. But now with this, and since then, a lot of other things have happened, but now this is a major thing. And so with all this racism, right now it's racism against Asians and Asian Americans, but next year maybe, the focus, I'm saying racism is always here, but the focus may be against Mexicans or African Americans. We go through these cycles, but overall the racism is such a huge beast. It's embedded in our culture, and so we as Christians were wondering, how do we fight against it? And the forgiveness is also tied in with reconciliation. And reconciliation is always something I struggle with too. How do we reconcile? When we think about the cross and Jesus, with all these atonement theories that we have, Anselm's atonement theory, all these Christus Victor atonement theory, just my class, we were talking about atonement theory last week too. When we think about it, we focus on something with the reconciliation, God reconciling with us human beings. And then so there is a vertical reconciliation that may happen as we focus on the cross and the crucifixion and what happened, the mysterious thing that happened on that cross. But then sometimes as Christians, we forget about the horizontal relationship, right? So, we're always asking God to forgive us. So the vertical, we're not so bad about, but it's always a horizontal that we're really bad about. So asking for forgiveness from our brothers and sisters, either as individuals or as communities, and then also the reconciliation that needs to happen between brothers and sisters. So that is always lacking. And so maybe in light of this pandemic, maybe we could think of the 7 last words of Jesus, and particularly the focus of, Jesus saying, forgive them for they do not know what they're doing, is a reminder that many times we don't know what we're doing. A lot of the progressive white allies and friends, they think that they're not part of this racism, but it's so embedded in our culture. Just by being white, you are with this white privilege kind of participating in either in this microaggressions or things happening. So in many cases, my talk is kind of focusing on racism, but there's a lot of other things that we're committing against each other wrongfully. And so many times we don't realize that we're doing this. I think it's a reminder that, these issues are all intersecting too. So intersectionality is important to understand. And the words of Jesus reminds us that we have, I think we as Christians are very good with the vertical relationship, but not the horizontal. So the words of Jesus on that cross reminds us of to ask for forgiveness across the horizontal relationship. And that includes us with our neighbors and also those who are farther away in the global kind of society. I think this pandemic is really reinforcing us how we are so interconnected. Everything happens. How quickly this spread, is just an indicative of how connected we are and how we are interweaving with one another. So we need to ask for forgiveness from each other and also from the planet with creation, because we are committing sin against creation too. We are not living sustainably. We are hoarding and we are just taking things from the earth and we're damaging the earth. So I think we commit sin in so many ways. So we need to recognize, I started off this interview focusing on racism, but there's a lot of other sins that we commit. So I just want to also kind of bring to light that all these other sins that we're committing against the planet and against each other, and that ultimately they do intersect and they affect one another. So I think the words of Jesus is kind of reminding us in this new light of the pandemic happening that, many cases we don't know what we're doing, that we're doing something wrong. And so Jesus is reminding us in many different ways that we are committing sin and we need to ask for forgiveness and forgive one another.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And I think, a thing that runs through your work is, that to become aware sometimes of those things that we are doing that we are not aware of, requires that we so go beyond our familiar circles and encounter the other and actually hear from people who've been pushed to the margins the ways in which they have, that we need to ask forgiveness, what it is that we have done, and then also what it is then to seek repair and restitution on that path to reconciliation. I think that's something that comes through really well in your work. And as you say, that's because, how do we find out that thing? We might be sparked by this reading to go, yes, I do need to ask for forgiveness, and I have been sinning in ways that I'm not aware of, but we're not going to necessarily understand what they are, so to avoid them in the future without listening.
And these days I'm kind of writing on the invisibility of Asian American, and particularly Asian American women. And so when I shared a little bit about the racism against Asians and Asian Americans. So in certain ways, we become invisible in this society, in American society. We are in smaller population, but the racism here in the US is talked about in black and white dichotomy. So it's kind of been like that from the beginning, mostly from the American history. So in one sense, we become invisible people. So this anti-Asian racism that's happening today, I'm told yesterday, I've never heard it labeled that they were arrested for hate crime. And I was really glad to see that, because this is hate crime against another group of people. But the other side of this is many times our issues become invisible too. So when we experience racism, the common society, the dominant culture and society want to brush it off and say, oh, it's not that important. So it's not just that we become invisible, but then our issues also become invisible. So I'm hoping that through this pandemic, that more and more churches will speak up, and that there will be a great solidarity amongst all of us, that we can stand together, because today it may be Asian Americans, tomorrow it may be somebody else. So we need to be in solidarity. We need to speak up for those who are made invisible, who are made marginalized, who are pushed to the side, who are made voiceless. So right now during the pandemic, it's Asians and Asian Americans. But like I said, tomorrow maybe somebody else. So I think it's important. And also having people like you as white allies standing in solidarity with us and speaking up and against racism that happens overall and against certain groups of people. So I'm always grateful for the work that you do. And, you are always so welcoming of the diverse voices. That's so important, because some people who do these things, they just focus on some white men all the time. We've heard from white men for the last 2,000 years. I think people might be a little sick of the white men voices. But people still continue to listen to them. But there's not that many people like you who still want to give voice to those who are voiceless and those who have been marginalized. So I'm always grateful for you, and for also picking the good topics. So I think the last 7 words of Jesus, so crucial for us today. I think is so meaningful for us. And, I'm so excited to hear the other 6 people that you are interviewing and what their answers are. And so I think this is very, very exciting. So thank you for your work.
Thank you, Grace. What a great place to end, and a good encouragement for people to keep listening, because you're the first. So, hopefully you've set a great tone and helped to sell the premise, which is also very helpful.
Well, I hope that after my first one that they'll listen to the other 6.
Yes, hopefully.
Yeah, they're all just equally important. And I think, and particularly at this time, during this pandemic, when people are glued to their laptop and their phones, I think it'll be very exciting and challenging. And I hope people will be challenged by the 7 words of Jesus and the impact that it will have for us during this, fearful time. I keep checking the news, and I know I shouldn't be, but I keep checking the news all day long. And I know I'm not the only one. So there's a great amount of fear in the world today, because it's so contagious, it spreads so quickly, and people die so fast. So I know there's great fear, and I think we need to continue to pray the prayer that Jesus has taught us, and remember those 7 words of Jesus that he spoke on the cross. I think they are very meaning for us during this time. So thank you for highlighting it, and thank you again for inviting me. And I hope after this dies down that we can meet each other face to face.
It'd be great to be in the room again with you, Grace. That would be
Yeah.
wonderful.
Wonderful people too.
If people have intrigued by what Grace is saying and want to find out more, I recommend particularly her books Embracing the Other, The Transformative Spirit of Love, which is out with Eerdmans, and Healing Our Broken Humanity, which was co-written with Graham Hill, which is through IVP. But she has many books, both written and edited, including a very recent book, which we'll have to get you back on to talk about, Reimagining Spirit,
Yes.
the new book she has out. So Grace's info will be in the
And why
show notes.
don't you know what? It's going to be hard, but we can maybe get Reverend Jackson to come on to talk about keeping hope alive. So it'll be a 3-way conversation. That may be a possibility. It needs to be a short one, but I think that might be exciting too.
Right.
And I actually have another one coming out in June, a new book called Hope in Disarray. Actually, I wish it was out right now when people need a little bit of hope. But people can read it. Hopefully by June, this will have died down.
Yeah. Then we'll be rebuilding hope and the book will still be prescient. But it's another reason I love to interview you, Grace, is because I always find out, like, you know, we're talking about the book that came out 2 months ago, and you're like, and I got another book, you know, about a month and a half from now, you know,
so
3 more coming later.
That got cut off, right? But I just wanted to say, stay safe, you and your wife and your little one. So please stay safe.
Thank you.